She was just trying to help carry the flower girl's bag when the bride's mother snapped at her in front of everyone. But the moment the groom turned around and saw her face, everything stopped. Before we begin, comment below where you're watching from, and don't forget to rate the story from 0 to 10 at the end. The morning air buzzed with luxury and tension. A sprawling estate just outside the city had been transformed into a floral dream, every detail curated to reflect prestige, money, and perfection. From the string quartet rehearsing near the altar to the synchronized kitchen staff finalizing trays of hors d'oeuvres, the entire venue pulsed with the kind of orchestrated chaos only a high society wedding could generate. Leona stepped through the back gate, her hands clutching the small floral tote belonging to the flower girl. She wasn't dressed like the other women there, no silk, no heels, no glittering jewelry catching the sun. Instead, she wore a modest cream blouse and a long navy skirt that whispered utility more than fashion. Her hair was tied in a practical knot, a few loose strands framing a face worn by long days and quiet sacrifices. There was grace in her stillness, though no one seemed to notice or care. She wasn't supposed to enter the main hall. Her job was simple: accompany the flower girl until her mother was free, keep her calm, then quietly vanish before the ceremony began. But when the little girl's mother became occupied with photographers and makeup artists, the child began to panic. She clung to Leona's hand, refusing to let go, her small voice quivering with the kind of fear only a 5-year-old could understand. "Please come with me," the girl whispered. "Don't leave me alone." And Leona, never one to abandon a frightened child, stepped forward. It was a small act, compassionate, instinctive, but it was enough to ignite a spark in a room full of dry egos. As she crossed the threshold into the ornate hall, walking carefully behind the flower girl, one of the wedding planners noticed her, then whispered something to someone else. Seconds later, the bride's mother, dressed in a pristine white pantsuit and dripping with pearls, spun around with military precision. Her voice sliced through the ambient noise like a blade. "Who are you, and why are you in here?" Leona froze. The room fell silent, eyes turned, forks paused mid-air. Someone audibly gasped. "I asked you a question," the woman repeated. "You don't belong here. This is not the back entrance. Take your things and leave. Now." Leona's mouth opened, but words failed. The little girl stared at her with wide eyes. A heat spread up Leona's neck as judgmental stares bore into her from every direction. She lowered her gaze, nodded faintly, and turned to retreat. That's when Madison, the groom, turned around from the altar where he'd been adjusting his boutonniere. His gaze fell on her face, and his breath caught. Madison didn't say a word at first. He simply stood still, staring, as if time had folded in on itself. For a moment, he wasn't the groom surrounded by florists and champagne and a camera crew, waiting to capture every breath of his perfect day. He was a boy again, small, lonely, hiding behind the staircase after his parents' fights, and she was there. Always there, Leona. But the room didn't wait for her memories. The bride's mother, still standing tall in her heels and entitlement, scoffed and turned toward the nearby staff. "Can someone please escort this woman out?" Leona's grip on the child's bag tightened. Her posture remained soft, almost submissive, yet something flickered behind her eyes, something Madison hadn't seen in years. She wasn't just confused or embarrassed. She looked wounded. The flower girl tugged on Leona's hand. "Where are you going?" she asked, her small voice now trembling. "I'll be right outside, sweetheart," Leona said gently, crouching to eye level. "Everything will be okay." But before she could take another step back, Madison walked toward her, past the puzzled groomsman, past his mother-in-law's shocked expression. His movements were slow but deliberate, each step louder than the music still playing faintly in the background. "Leona?" he asked, his voice low but thick with disbelief. She looked up at him, her lips parting slightly. I didn't mean to interrupt," she said, barely audible. But Madison didn't respond right away. His expression wasn't one of anger or embarrassment. It was something else, a quiet awe, a wave of recognition crashing against the shore of time. "You remember me," he said, more statement than question. Leona offered a gentle nod. Of course I do. By now, everyone had stopped pretending not to watch. Even the bride across the room had turned to see what had arrested her fiancé mid-step. But only Madison and Leona seemed to exist in that moment like a secret had been spoken aloud and no one else could quite understand the language. And just like that, the wedding lost its rhythm. A hush settled over the wedding hall, the kind of silence that didn't come gently but crashed like a wave, sweeping every murmur, every forced laugh, every orchestral note into stillness. The string quartet froze mid-phrase, the photographer lowered his camera, and the caterers paused with trays half raised. All eyes followed Madison, still standing inches from Leona, his gaze locked onto her as if she were the only familiar thing in a room full of strangers. The bride's mother, whose voice had only moments ago sliced through the air like a blade, now looked visibly unsettled. Her fingers curled tightly around her clutch as she glanced around, as if expecting anyone to validate her outrage. But the room remained frozen, suspended between confrontation and revelation. Madison took a slow breath and stepped closer to Leona. His voice, when it came, was quiet, but carried an undeniable weight. "Why didn't you ever come back?" he asked, his tone somewhere between accusation and heartbreak. Leona, standing in the same simple blouse and skirt that made her seem so out of place among sequins and silk, straightened her shoulders slightly. She didn't answer immediately. Her fingers moved gently, instinctively, brushing the curls from the flower girl's forehead as if grounding herself in something pure before facing a question she'd buried for years. "I was told I wasn't welcome," she said softly. And I believed it. The words hung in the air like dust in a beam of light visible, inescapable. A few guests shifted uncomfortably. Someone coughed in the corner. The bride looked from Madison to Leona and then back again, her expression unreadable. Madison's lips parted, but he said nothing. He just looked at her, really looked. And in that long, echoing silence, something changed. It wasn't just recognition anymore, it was regret. And everyone could feel it. Madison didn't move, but inside, everything did. It was as if someone had thrown open a door in the back of his mind, flooding the present with fragments of a childhood he thought he'd forgotten, or maybe had chosen to forget. The scent of lavender on freshly folded laundry, the scratchy couch where he'd fall asleep mid-story, the woman who never raised her voice, who never asked for anything, who stood between him and the shadows when no one else did. That woman was standing right in front of him now. He remembered the way she used to sit cross-legged on the floor with him, reading aloud from picture books in a voice that could make monsters seem misunderstood and heroes feel human. He remembered the peanut butter sandwiches she'd cut diagonally, like he preferred, and how she'd always wait until he finished eating before having her own. He remembered a stormy night when the power had gone out, and she held him while the thunder rolled, humming a lullaby his own mother had long since stopped singing. Leona hadn't just been the nanny, she'd been the constant, the compass, the only adult who'd ever looked at him without a filter of ambition or expectation. And now, as he stood in the middle of his own wedding rehearsal, wearing a custom-tailored suit and the heavy weight of family legacy on his shoulders, Madison realized something gutting. He had no idea what had happened to her after she left. He had never asked, never searched. He had simply accepted her absence, the way a child accepts loss they're too young to understand. Until now. Now she was back, not as a guest, not as a friend of the family, but as the help, and being treated like she never mattered. His throat tightened. He turned slowly toward the crowd, aware that dozens of eyes were still on him, waiting to see what the groom would do next. But all he could think of was one question repeating like a drumbeat in his chest. How did we let her vanish? And why did no one care that she was gone? Madison didn't hesitate. As if pulled by an invisible thread, he stepped away from his groomsmen, away from the chaos of the rehearsal, and walked directly toward Leona. Conversations fizzled out mid-sentence, heads turned. Someone dropped a champagne glass and it shattered softly against the stone floor. But Madison didn't flinch. His eyes never left hers. Leona, clutching the flower girl's bag like it was armor, looked unsure whether to stand her ground or flee. Her lips parted, maybe to apologize again, maybe to explain herself, but she didn't get the chance. Madison reached her. and in front of every single person present, the florist rearranging peonies, the bride's mother still fuming, the groom's father whispering something sharp to the wedding planner, Madison gently took Leona's hand. The moment was so quiet, it felt like time had paused. Her skin was colder than he remembered, more fragile, but the warmth behind her eyes was unmistakable. She opened her mouth again, this time whispering his name, Maddie, like she wasn't sure if he was real. He gave her a nod that held years of unsaid gratitude. "You remember me," he said, quietly, not as a statement, but as a confirmation of something he desperately needed to be true. "I could never forget you," she replied, voice trembling. Gasps rippled through the crowd. No one could place her. No one had any idea who this woman was, only that she had just broken every rule of class and status by simply being seen, by being touched, by being acknowledged. But Madison didn't care. He turned toward the guests and lifted their joined hands lightly into the air, as if presenting evidence of something deeper than blood, older than titles. "Before you judge someone," he said, voice clear and unwavering, "you might want to know who they really are." Then he looked directly at the bride's mother, and the temperature in the room dropped by 10 degrees. No one dared speak. Even the string quartet in the corner had gone still, bows hovering midair. The bride's mother looked as though someone had slapped her, her mouth caught open, eyes darting between her daughter, her son-in-law-to-be, and the woman she had just humiliated. But Madison didn't flinch. He stepped forward, still holding Leona's hand, and turned to face the gathering. "You all saw what just happened," he began, voice steady, but carrying the weight of something far deeper than the moment allowed. "But what you didn't see is who this woman really is. You didn't see the nights she stayed up with me when I had night terrors as a child, holding my hand until I fell asleep. You didn't see her reading me stories when my own parents were too busy preparing for galas just like this one." People exchanged glances. A few of the older guests began whispering behind gloved hands. Madison wasn't finished. "She is the reason I learned to tie a tie. She is the one who taught me to be kind when kindness wasn't fashionable. She brought me soup when I had the flu and made sure I didn't feel invisible in a house that treated staff like wallpaper." He turned back to Leona. Her lips trembled, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. He gave her a small, reassuring smile, then looked toward the crowd again. "You shouted at her," he said, directing it squarely at the bride's mother. "But you didn't ask who she was. You didn't ask why she was helping. You just saw someone you thought didn't belong and tried to erase her." The silence was deafening. The bride looked torn, clutching her bouquet like it might anchor her in a world that had just tilted on its axis. Her friends beside her looked uncomfortable, fidgeting with their dresses. The groom's father stared hard at his son, like seeing a side of him he'd never understood before. But Madison only tightened his grip on Leona's hand. "This woman helped raise me," he said, "and I'll be damned if I let anyone treat her like she's disposable." A single clap broke the silence, slow, deliberate, then another and another. The groom's younger sister, eyes red and glassy, stood up and crossed the floor. Without saying a word, she wrapped her arms around Leona, and in that instant, the story of the wedding changed. The applause faded, but the tension lingered like a storm cloud that hadn't decided whether to pass or break. In the front row, the bride's mother stood frozen, her expression contorted between rage and disbelief. She finally turned, heels clicking sharply on the marble as she stormed out, her exit as loud as her earlier humiliation attempt. No one followed. The guests were left in an emotional limbo, unsure of which side to take, torn between tradition and truth, appearances and authenticity. Some murmured about the disruption of the ceremony, clutching their champagne flutes as if decorum might still be salvaged. Others looked visibly moved, their gazes locked on Leona like they were seeing her for the first time. In the center of it all stood Madison and Leona, their hands still joined, their silhouettes framed by the floral archway that had been designed for vows, not confrontations. He hadn't moved, and she, though trembling, had begun to lift her head higher, her shoulders less hunched, her eyes a little more steady. Then, through the hush, came soft sobbing. Madison's younger sister, Elise, stepped forward again, this time not to speak but to act. She gently took Leona's other hand and held it with the tenderness of a long-lost relative. "You were my second mother," she whispered, loud enough that nearby guests could hear. "I remember everything." The emotional ripples spread. Another cousin stood. Then an aunt. A man from the groom's side of the family walked over and respectfully nodded at Leona before returning to his seat. But others weren't so warm. A group from the bride's extended circle exchanged skeptical glances and began texting furiously, the kind of guests who measured weddings by seating charts and floral centerpieces, not moments of truth. The bride remained rooted in place, visibly shaken, her fingers locked around her bouquet as if it were a lifeline. She hadn't spoken, not yet. And while the ceremony hadn't officially started, everyone knew that something far more important had already begun. The line between guest and witness had blurred. This was no longer just a wedding. It was the unraveling of facades and the reckoning of buried truths. Madison turned to Leona again. "We're not done," he said gently. "But I need you to stay, please." And for the first time since she had entered the venue, Leona gave a small nod. Not to please anyone, not to play a role, but because the boy she had once raised was now a man, standing up for her when no one else did. As murmurs echoed throughout the garden, Madison gently guided Leona away from the crowd, and through the winding corridor that led to a quieter room just off the main hall. The tall glass doors closed behind them with a soft click, sealing them away from the whispers, the stares, and the fragmented judgments still unfolding outside. Leona stood near the window, the sheer curtain casting faint shadows on her dress, her arms crossed tightly across her chest, not in defiance but in defense. She didn't speak. She didn't have to. The silence between them was thick with years left unsaid. Madison approached slowly, loosening his tie as if shedding the weight of formality would make this moment any easier. His voice was low, almost raw. "Why did you leave like that? You just disappeared." Leona's back remained to him. For a moment he thought she wouldn't answer. But then she spoke, each word quiet but deliberate, like peeling off bandages from a wound that had never truly healed. "Because I wasn't allowed to stay." He blinked. "What do you mean?" "My mom said you left for a better job." She turned now, eyes locking with his, and there was pain in them. Not fresh, but familiar, etched in over time. "That's what she told you. What she didn't say was that she gave me a choice. Disappear or be destroyed." Madison's throat tightened. "Destroyed? Why would she?" "She saw something," Leona interrupted gently. "Or maybe just feared something. Your father, he started to notice me. In ways he shouldn't have. I shut it down. Every time. But your mother, she saw the danger, not in him, in me." The confession landed like a thunderclap. Madison's jaw clenched. Not in disbelief, but in the kind of horrified understanding that only comes when the last puzzle piece finally clicks into place. "I was 17 when I came to your family," Leona continued. "I didn't ask for any of it. I loved you and Elise like my own." But she couldn't risk the possibility, not the whispers, not the shame, so she paid me to vanish. He ran a hand through his hair, suddenly remembering the cold silence that followed her exit, how no one dared ask questions. How it had always felt unfinished. "I searched for you," he whispered. "For years." Leona's voice broke then, the composure she'd clung to for so long beginning to crack. "And I watched you grow up from a distance. I came to your graduation. I stood across the street at your first job. I couldn't come close, Madison. I wasn't allowed." Tears welled in his eyes, but he refused to blink them away. "You should have told me." "I couldn't risk making your life harder," she said, her voice barely a breath. "Not then, not until now." Outside, the wedding music had begun again. But in that room, a different ceremony was taking place, one not marked by vows, but by truth finally spoken and wounds finally acknowledged. And as Madison stepped closer, reaching for her hand again, Leona didn't flinch. She let him. Because hiding was no longer an option. The room fell still, time slowing between the silence of his outstretched hand and the weight of what had just been said. Madison didn't let go. His grip wasn't forceful, but steady, as if holding on to her now might somehow pull her back from every year they'd lost. Leona sat down on the edge of a velvet bench by the window, the fabric catching the evening light in deep crimsons and golds. Her shoulders were still drawn inward, but her eyes didn't avoid his anymore. He pulled a nearby chair and sat opposite her, not as the groom, not as the center of the day's celebration, but as a man unraveling everything he thought he knew about the woman in front of him. Madison's voice dropped to a level that carried both disbelief and rising anger. He made you uncomfortable, and she blamed you? Leona nodded slowly. He never touched me. But there were looks, long stares, too many excuses to be alone. I was barely out of my teens, and I knew what it meant if she ever believed I was even remotely to blame, and she did. Or at least it was easier for her to believe that than to confront what her husband had become. The truth hung like smoke between them. Madison stared past her for a second, toward the hallway they'd just left, as if trying to reconcile the version of his parents he'd always known with this new and fractured image. She told us you left because you didn't feel welcome anymore, he said slowly, and that it was your choice to go. She made it sound like you'd outgrown us. I did leave, Leona replied, but only because she made it clear I had no other choice. She gave me money, not to start over, but to vanish. She even had a driver take me to the edge of town that night. Said if I ever came back or spoke to anyone, she'd ruin me. Madison felt his jaw tighten again, but this time it wasn't grief that boiled inside, it was fury. He stood up, pacing the floor once before turning back toward her. I believed her. For years I believed her. I hated that you didn't even say goodbye. I wanted to, she said gently. But I was afraid you'd ask questions I wasn't allowed to answer. Outside the door, faint laughter from the party trickled through, ironic and distant. Inside, Madison walked toward the glass pane behind her, resting his hand against it. He whispered, "She used you to keep her marriage intact. To protect a man who couldn't be trusted with a girl he should have protected." Leona didn't respond, but her silence confirmed it all. Then he turned, and something had shifted in his eyes. Not just sadness or even rage, but resolve. If she wants to protect a lie, let her try. I'm done protecting their version of the truth. He looked back at her, and his voice was calm, striking in its finality. It's time everyone hears who you really are. Madison didn't hesitate. As the music continued to echo from the dance floor, he pushed open the double doors of the reception hall, his posture tall and certain. Guests turned, glasses paused midair. Conversation stopped. The sight of the groom walking in with a woman no one recognized, but everyone remembered, sent a wave of uneasy murmurs through the crowd. He walked straight to the microphone at the front, where the band had just finished their set. With a firm hand, he motioned to the sound technician. The feedback crackled for a second before his voice filled the room. I need your attention. The room obeyed. This woman, he said, gesturing beside him, was once part of my family, not by blood, but by presence, by love. She raised me when my parents were too busy. She held me when I was afraid of storms. She taught me how to tie my shoes, how to stand up straight, and how to be kind. And one night she disappeared. No goodbyes, no explanation, just gone. He paused, the emotion thickening his voice but never breaking it. For years I was told she left, that she grew tired of our household and chose to move on. But today I found out the truth. She didn't leave. She was pushed out, silenced, branded a threat. Not because she did anything wrong, but because someone in this room was too ashamed to admit the real reason she had to go. The crowd was frozen. Even those who didn't know Leona could feel the weight of every word. Madison's eyes scanned the guests, some wide-eyed, others guilty, others simply stunned. I won't say names. If you know, you know. But I will say this, from this moment on, Leona is not just my past. She is part of this family again. And if that makes anyone uncomfortable, the door is right behind you. He turned to Leona and took her hand in front of everyone, not out of pity, not out of spectacle, but as a son reclaiming a piece of his soul. Today is supposed to be about love. Real love, the kind that lasts, the kind that gets tested, the kind that sometimes disappears and still finds its way back. A few guests clapped, hesitant at first, then more. And soon the applause filled the room, not thunderous but real. Madison didn't wait for approval. He walked Leona to the front table, beside the bride. A seat was pulled, a glass of champagne poured. She was no longer a shadow. She had a place again, this time in the light. For a moment all eyes turned to the bride. She had remained seated as Madison spoke, her fingers curled tightly around the stem of her glass, her expression unreadable. The room held its breath as if her silence might break the fragile peace that had just begun to settle. Leona stood near Madison, her hands folded, her gaze lowered, not out of shame but out of habit. She had spent so many years quietly stepping aside, letting others speak first. But now the bride rose. Her name was Isabel, a woman of poise and strength, raised in a world of polished appearances and whispered judgments. She stepped forward slowly, her heels clicking against the marble floor with a rhythm that seemed to echo like a heartbeat. Everyone expected her to walk to Madison's side, or worse, away from him entirely. Instead, she walked toward Leona. When she stopped, barely inches away, Leona finally looked up. Their eyes met, and something passed between them that no one else could fully understand. "I know who you are," Isabel said quietly, but firmly. "I didn't remember at first, but I've seen you before. I was only 6, maybe 7. I was crying behind the greenhouse because I'd spilled juice on my dress before some family gathering. And you were the one who found me." Leona blinked, surprised. "You gave me a lollipop from your pocket," Isabel continued, a faint smile breaking through. "You told me I was still the most beautiful girl at the party. You didn't even work for my family. You were just there, helping." The bride's voice trembled slightly, but she kept speaking. "I grew up in a home where people like you weren't seen. At least not as equals. You were just the help. But you were the one who offered comfort, who noticed, who cared. And I'm sorry I didn't remember you sooner." Then in front of everyone, Isabel did something unexpected. She took Leona's hand. "You don't belong in the shadows of this day," she said. "You belong at the heart of it." And then she turned to the crowd, holding Leona's hand high as if presenting a long-lost family heirloom that had finally been returned. "This woman helped shape the man I married. She reminded him of who he is. She reminded me of who I want to be. It was not a performance. There were no dramatic tears, no orchestrated smiles, just raw human grace. And in that moment, every carefully curated detail of the wedding, the floral arrangements, the expensive place settings, the designer dresses faded into the background. What remained was something rare and unforgettable. Dignity, redemption, and a woman who, for the first time in decades, was seen. For years, Leona had imagined this kind of moment, but never like this. Not with all these eyes watching. Not with this many hearts cracking open in real time. As the bride's words settled over the crowd like a balm, something shifted. People who had stayed seated out of caution now rose. One by one, they walked toward Leona, not with pity, but with reverence. Madison's sister was the first, her voice trembling as she whispered, "I remember you singing to me when I was sick. I never forgot that." Then came an elderly guest, then a cousin, then a florist who had recognized Leona from somewhere long ago. All came forward, each offering some tiny piece of memory she'd left behind like breadcrumbs. Leona's throat tightened as Madison wrapped an arm gently around her shoulder. "You're not invisible anymore," he said softly. "You never were." But now the rest of them see it too. His words anchored her. Her spine straightened. Her hands, once tucked to her chest, now held steady at her sides. At the reception, her name was printed on a name card for the head table, right between Madison and Isabel. The seat hadn't been there an hour ago. Now it was waiting. And as the music swelled, as glasses clinked and laughter returned to the air, Madison raised his champagne. "To Leona," he said. "To the woman who raised me, who protected me, who disappeared so that I could thrive and who came back so that we could finally heal." The toast was met with standing applause. Leona blinked back tears but didn't look away this time. She met the crowd's gaze head on. For the first time in decades, she stood not as someone's background, not as a whisper in someone else's story, but as the beating heart of her own. As the evening faded into golden light, children danced, old friends reunited, and laughter spilled out into the garden like warmth from a long-closed window. And there, just beyond the roses, Leona stood between Madison and Isabel as they gently led her to the center of the dance floor. She hadn't danced in years, but tonight she did.